Привет всем, с вами я, Janey, и это How Janey Learned Russian. So we are now starting our review of Accusative Case, and as you've seen in my previous videos, as we get to the end of the chapter, you get to see me make a fool of myself talking to my imaginary friends. So I like to bring the language to life by letting you imagine that you're talking to them. So that's what we will be doing today. And I'm going to show you how to create what I call conversation trees, how to keep the conversation going even when you're talking to an imaginary friend. But before we get started with all of that, we of course have to talk about our интересный кусочек информации дня, the interesting tidbit of information of the day. And remember, the theme for this chapter was Куда надо пойти в Москве? Where do you need to go in Moscow? And these are just some of my favorite places. So everybody's going to have their own opinions. I haven't been to Moscow in so long, so I'm sure a lot of this has changed, and there's probably a lot cooler stuff going on. But one of those places that I stumbled upon one day a lot in one of my walks, I didn't even know what was happening. It was so cool. There was no place where I had to like buy tickets or anything. I'm just walking around, and then suddenly there's just like all these like statues and busts and a lot of them are just in piles, and like some of them are just kind of laying on the grass. Anyway, now they've turned it into like more of an official outdoor museum. It seems to be called Museum, but back then it was apparently called Park Iskustv, or I've also seen it called Park Skulptur. So this was kind of, they called it like the burial ground for all of those Soviet Union statues. And so they would just gather them throughout the city. And once they weren't the Soviet Union anymore, they kind of just dumped them in this park. So when I was there, it was super cool because just so much stuff just laying around and like very abandoned. Again, if you're a lover of Soviet Union history, this was like a super cool place to be. Lots of Lenin statues. And then in this park, still to this day, is the statue of Dzerzhinsky, which used to be out in front of Lubyanka. Do you know what Lubyanka was the headquarters of? That was the headquarters of the KGB. And when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, people came in a demonstration of like joy, I guess, that there was no more KGB. They came and took down the Dzerzhinsky monument. Then it laid around in this Park Skulptur for quite a while, and now, as you can see over here, it is in fact upright. Okay, another such statue that I remember seeing, and I feel like when I saw it in 2005, it was laying on the ground. But maybe I'm crazy. Maybe if you know more details about like the timeline of this park, feel free to correct me in the comments. But there used to be the statue of Stalin. Notice his face is bashed in. And then behind him is this kind of memorial to the Stalinist repressions. That this artist wanted it to be near a statue of Stalin. So I remember seeing this. I remember seeing this Stalin statue. Like I said, in my mind, when I saw it, it was laying on the ground. Like, as you can see here. Now, interestingly, I went to the Wikipedia page as I was putting together these slides, and I stumbled upon this, which is like mind-blowing. So apparently November of 2025, somebody took all of this down. They took down the Stalin statue and the memorial to the Stalinist repression. So it's just gone. So this is why I think Russian history is the most fascinating history, because how many countries have done a complete political 180 that many times in your lifetime? Like, it's insane, you never know what's going to happen in that country. So keeps you on your toes. Anyway, so that is my интересный кусочек информации дня.
Now my plug. Remember, all of these videos are based on my textbook called Russian Cases Made Slightly Less Scary. That's available for purchase over on Patreon. You can buy a hard copy if you're in the United States. I just am sending one out in the mail today. Matt, hello, I'm sending that out to you. So I hope, like I said, you can go over there and purchase that. Please buy it on the website. Save yourself $20. The app charges you more money. Also, please, as you're going through these lessons, a great way to help solidify all of this knowledge in your head is to have accountability. And you can get that accountability by joining up on our group classes, which meet 3 times a week. And then if you miss any of the classes, there will be a video available of the class, which you can just kind of listen to like as if you're a fly on the wall. So here we are, me and my imaginary Russian friends. Again, I am not saying I morally agree with any of these people. I know several of them are responsible for the deaths of many people, but we're just gonna pretend like we're talking to them because it's great practice for the language. So let's go ahead and start with our first person. So in the textbook, you start off by asking this famous person a question, then he answers, and then you have to come up with a follow-up question based on what he says. Okay, so we say, Юрий Андреевич, что вы видели, когда вы были в космосе? Okay, so now the way he answers is going to force him to use accusative case because he's doing something to the moon, he's doing something to the earth, he's seeing it. Accusative case. So he says, я видел Луну, звезды и Землю. Было круто. Now my follow-up question is, а Россию видели? Notice the very interesting word syntax. That Russian is flexible like that. We can change the words around, the word order around. А Россию видели? And did you see Russia? And he says, конечно, я видел Россию и многие земли из космоса. Of course, I saw Russia and many lands from space. Then we go in two different directions. We branch out like a tree. Okay, so based on that, I came up with the follow-up question. Вы когда-нибудь путешествовали за границу? You know, maybe he's only ever seen all these lands and he hasn't necessarily been there. So I'm following up with that. Вы когда-нибудь путешествовали за границу? By the way, this is a really great phrase that's getting accusative case. It means abroad, internationally. You hear it very often in Russian. За границу, it means beyond the border. So I ask him, вы когда-нибудь путешествовали за границу? And then Юрий Андреевич answers, много раз. В США, в Европу, даже в Южную Америку. Wow, cool. He's traveled all over, duh. Okay, my other follow-up question was, какие места вы любите в России? All right, so this is going to force him to answer with some accusative case because he's loving it. Я люблю реку Волгу. Да? And this is all based in fact, by the way. He loved the Volga River. Я люблю реку Волгу. Вот так. Окей. Следующий человек – это Петр Ильич Чайковский. So, what would you ask Петр Ильич Чайковский? What would you ask him, right? And I ask him, Петр Ильич, какую музыку вы пишете? Какую музыку вы пишете? And he says, классическую музыку. Вы, наверное, знаете мой балет «Щелкунчик». Да, мы знаем этот балет. Очень популярно во время Рождества. Правда? Okay, then from there I do a follow-up question. А какую музыку вы сами любите? So now I ask him, well, what music? So you write that kind of music, but what kind of music do you like, right? Какую музыку вы сами любите? Like you personally, what kind of music do you personally like? And he says, я люблю русскую народную музыку и европейскую музыку. Okay, so he just said, I love Russian folk music. Я люблю русскую народную музыку и европейскую музыку and European music. Oh, okay, so let's ask him a follow-up question to that. I'm going to ask him, what composers do you like? So I'm switching to like here because otherwise we'd have to get genitive plural, which we don't know. So let's switch to, the reason for genitive plural is because it's an animate, right? Composers are living creatures. So I'm going to say, какие композиторы вам нравятся? What composers are pleasing to you? And he says, очень нравится Бетховен и Моцарт. Да? Очень нравится Бетховен и Моцарт. Вот, окей? Следующий человек. Петр Великий. Да. So I say to Peter the First, I say, Петр, Ваше Величество, это правда, что Санкт-Петербург более похож на европейский город, чем на Москву? Oh, do you remember all of that? Похож на. And then более just means more so. То есть это правда, is it true, что Санкт-Петербург более похож на европейский город, чем на Москву? Is it true that St. Petersburg is more similar to a European city than it is to Moscow? And then Петр Великий says, да, я очень не люблю Москву. Фу, я люблю Европу. Петербург похож на Венецию. Да? So that is, да, я очень не люблю Москву. I really do not love Moscow, which is very true. He had a lot of PTSD associated with Moscow. He wanted to get the hell out of there. And then he says, фу, meaning yuck. Ugh. Я люблю Европу. Петербург похож на Венецию. So Petersburg is similar to Venice. They call it the Russian Venice because of all the canals running throughout the city. Вот. So now I come up with 2 follow-up questions. Ну почему вы не любите Москву? Да? Why don't you love Moscow? Почему вы не любите Москву? Now I didn't go into his childhood trauma here, but this is another true thing about him. Она, because Москва is a feminine, right? Она такая старомодная. Она слишком далеко от Европы. Да? So, такая старомодная means old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. И она слишком далеко находится от Европы. He didn't like that Moscow was so isolated from Europe, whereas St. Petersburg is just right across from Sweden and Finland. So that's why he much preferred that location. Okay? Another follow-up question that I asked him is, почему вы так любите европейскую культуру? So why do you love so much European culture? Почему вы так любите европейскую культуру? And he says, and again, this is all based on fact. I highly recommend reading a biography of Петр Великий. He's an extremely fascinating person. He says, потому что я хочу модернизацию в России. See if you can figure out what that word means. Модернизацию в России. В Европе все интересно и умно. So he says, because I want modernization in Russia. In Europe, everything is interesting and smart. Which, yeah, he goes and travels all throughout Europe and learns how to build ships and learns about medicine and dentistry and all those things that were just commonplace in Europe at that point. Okay, so Lenin, I don't know if you've noticed, but we have a joke, an inside joke going on with Lenin. So remember in the first chapter I say, извините, Ленин, я забыл, какая революция ваша? Октябрьская революция или французская? And then in all caps he says, Великая Октябрьская коммунистическая революция. Okay, then when we got to prepositional case, I asked him, о чем ты часто думаешь, Владимир Ильич? And he says, Великой Октябрьской коммунистической революции. And then, what do you think? Just tell me if you can anticipate where this is headed. Now we're in accusative case. And I say, Владимир Ильич, что ты любишь? What do you think he's going to say? Just take a wild guess. Великую коммунистическую октябрьскую революцию. There you go. So Lenin, that seems to be all he cares about. I amuse myself, okay? I amuse myself. Next, we have Yosef Vissarionovich, Jugashvili Stalin. And we're just pretending that we're talking to him. What would we say to him in Russian, yeah? So we say, Иосиф Виссарионович, в какую страну вы бы хотели поехать? Right? So what country would you want to go to? And he says, никуда. Я не люблю Запад и не люблю летать. Это, кстати, это правда. These are all based in true facts. Я не люблю Запад и не люблю летать. Вот. That's why the Yalta Conference was in the Soviet Union, because он не хотел поехать никуда. Вот. Okay, so our follow-up question is, куда вы ездите, чтобы отдыхать? Куда вы ездите, чтобы отдыхать? Where do you go to vacation or to relax? And he says, в Сочи на мою дачу. Notice, I don't think I mentioned this, but a dacha is like an event, right? And a lot of times it was kind of an open air experience. So that's getting a na. That's getting a na. В Сочи на мою дачу или на мою родину. Okay. Oh, родина, your homeland. Ну, где ваша родина? Maybe you don't know this about Stalin. Горе. В Грузии. Я люблю наше вино и нашу грузинскую еду. Да, я очень люблю наше вино, грузинское вино и нашу грузинскую еду. И, кстати, это все правда. He even hired a special chef that could just recreate Georgian food for him all the time, so he didn't have to he didn't have to feel homesick for Georgian food. So, вот такие дела. Leave a comment below. What would you ask these people, and or who would your imaginary Russian friends be? Again, I highly encourage you to walk around having a conversation with yourself in Russian because it brings the language to life. And if you feel like a fool doing that, okay, well then come to class and have an actual conversation with actual living real life people. Okay? You do you, but I want you actually speaking the language with your mouth. Хорошо? Это все на сегодня. Увидимся завтра на следующем уроке. Пока-пока.